Welcome to My Home is Special. We're going to start this podcast journey in the first stop on our travels, Peru. I'll say it at the end, but go to myhomeisspecial.com to get updates and other content. For now, I hope you enjoy this first episode. Okay, Santiago, welcome to My Home is Special. Glad we're finally getting a chance to talk.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So one of the things I want to do with every guest we have on this little project is give people a sense of who they're listening to. So can you start by just introducing yourself to the people listening?
Of course. So my name is Santiago. I'm originally Peruvian. I was born and raised in Lima, went to high school there, then did my undergrad, studied economics. I worked based in Lima for a little bit, but I traveled quite a bit around South America, primarily Chile, Colombia, a little bit in Central America as well. Did that for some years and then moved to the US. Spent 2 years living in Chicago, which I loved, favorite city in the US. And then after studying there for a couple of years, I moved to London, which is now home and has been for the last 5 years or so.
And Santiago, I made this mistake when I first moved here. You said Chicago, which is a fantastic city and is my home as well. But you were technically in Evanston, which isn't Chicago, right?
Yes, correct. I was technically in Evanston, which I think of as part of Chicago. I think, what is it, 20 kilometers or something like that? But
Something
I lived
like
in
that.
Evanston.
What I learned is that people from Chicago are very sensitive to Evanston not being in Chicago. So Santiago, one of the things I'm looking forward to on this podcast is chatting with people that I know. And I thought it'd be interesting for people to know sort of how we know each other and how you ended up on the interview list today.
Yeah, sounds good. I think the first time we met was through a work event where we were both involved with some recruiting efforts for the company. And I think we worked together in 2 or 3 projects along the 6 months earlier in this year.
Yep.
That was how the relationship started.
Yeah, and I remember we were doing our year-end wrap-up for one of the business schools in Europe, and you were on there and you were presenting, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I was sort of in the back of my mind, maybe I wasn't fully dialed in, but I was thinking about how am I going to find people from all these countries I'm visiting in South America? And I said, wait a minute, he definitely doesn't sound like he's from London. So I literally, while you were presenting, went on LinkedIn and was like, wait, he went to school in Peru. And I think either during the meeting or right after the meeting, I emailed you and said something like, hey, randomly, did you grow up in Peru?
Yeah, exactly. I remember. When I read your email, I was actually thinking he's probably traveling there. He wants restaurant recommendations or where to go. But yeah, that's how it went.
In your defense, you did provide a lot of great recommendations and advice on what to do while we were in Peru, including where to stay and where to check out. So you did absolutely do that. But I had one more ask, which involved you being on the podcast. So thank you for saying yes, and thank you for joining today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so let's get into it. You've been away from home a lot since leaving for business school, coming to Chicago/Evanston. But we talked about the fact that you go home often when we were preparing for this. And in a lot of ways, that made you perfect for this. The more you told me a little bit about your story, you were in Peru, you came to the Chicagoland area, and now you live in Europe. I thought it'd be really great to talk about Peru and what you miss when you go home. And you said you do go home a decent amount. And so one of the things that you mentioned when we first chatted about this was family being important and a big part of the broader culture. Can you share a little bit about how that manifests itself down in Peru?
Yeah, of course. Let me start with my family. I have 2 younger sisters, and we're very, very close. We grew up together, obviously, but then I think something particular about Latin America in general is that when people turn 18 or when they finish high school, where they go to school is very often in the same city where they grew up and where they lived with their parents. So there's a little bit less of that dynamic that you see in the US or that you see in Europe, where once people finish their high school, they will travel to a different city for the right university. So that happens much less. What that means is that we stay longer in our parents' home, and people don't leave us young, which is really nice because there's this period after high school where you're starting to become an adult, you have your own friends, you start to drive, and you have this independent life, but at the same time, you're still really close to your family. You still go home and everyone's there. So I think there's a special kind of bond and relationship because you just get to spend a little bit of extra time versus in other cultures maybe.
Right. And does that mean it was hard when you decided to leave and go so far away to go to business school?
Yeah, it was really hard. I remember making the decision the decision process about like the pros and the cons. Like the pros were very clear, and the cons there was like one really big one, which was I'm going to be far away from my family and the people I love.
Right. Now, when you finished here, you didn't end up going back home. You ended up back in Europe. And how did that come about? And was the family a factor in that decision? Did they sort of encourage you to come home? Did they encourage you to spread your wings and see the rest of the world? How did you make the decision to move even further away from home over to Europe?
I think the I'm gonna call it the physical distance of being in Chicago didn't really change how close we are. So I would say obviously the frequency changes. Instead of seeing each other every day or every other day, it happens every couple of months or something like
Hmm.
that. But then it is fewer times, but maybe even more intense periods because you'll be together like 24/7, right? Like for that week or those couple of weeks a year.
Hmm.
So it was tough when I left because we didn't really know how that would play out. But after I was in Chicago, it doesn't mean it was easy, but it's kind of like the relationship changed, but didn't necessarily become more distant. So when I left for Europe, it was more of a little bit of a more natural step
Hmm.
than the first time that I left for Chicago. The distance is greater. I mean, like the flying distance is greater. But at the end of the day, one of my sisters ended up moving to Europe, who I see really, really often. So things started to change a little bit in that way as well.
It's funny, the distance forces some of the discipline. I know when I had my first travel case and I was out of town Monday through Thursday, my wife and I were a lot more intentional about having date plans for Friday night.
Yeah,
And when I wasn't traveling, I was home Monday through Friday. We'd go a month or two without actually having anything planned. But when
yeah,
we know we're only home for a little while at a time, we make the most of the time and don't take it for granted.
yeah. Makes sense. Definitely can relate.
The other thing that you mentioned was when you came to Chicago and moved up to Evanston was the role that the beach and the water and sort of being outside with friends and with family that you mentioned. Um, what was it like growing up with that being a part of your culture? Was the lake an appropriate substitute for the ocean when you moved from Peru to Evanston? I'm pretty sure I know the answer given the weather differences, but I have to ask it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, just for extra context, Lima is right by the Pacific coast. Some of the districts in Lima are just like a stone throws away. So growing up like over the summer and Lima has really nice weather over the summer, it's very common to spend almost every weekend at the beach because there's so many of them. It's very, very easily accessible. So water sports, playing volleyball, tennis at the beach, or football on the sand, having a ceviche, which is a very summer dish, is a big part of us growing up and sharing that with friends. So yes, you're very right. In addition, like my dad is a big lover of the sea, and he somehow has transmitted that to his kids. So the sea has always been a very important part for me. Moving to Chicago, I have to say the lake is not a substitute, but after living now in London that has a river, I have to say the lake is a closer substitute to the sea than a river in London. And I was able to jump in the lake a couple of times. We did take beach walks, or at least like walked on the sand, and even just looking at it or taking a run by the lake somehow brings that sense of it feels a little bit more familiar.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, when you were growing up and spending that time there, you said your dad had a love of the sea and imparted that. Were those some of your memories growing up? So when you get back home and you see the ocean, does it make you think about like your dad, the time you spent together, the time with your siblings, or is it more about the things that teenagers do when they're alone for the day, hanging out together on the beach? Like which memories come back first when you get home and see the water?
I think it is a little bit of both, and it is slightly weird because when I was a teenager, my parents' friends had kids that are more or less my age. So there were many occasions where they would intermingle with each other. So we would be with my parents' friends and their kids. And for part of the day, it would be, I don't know, kids versus parents playing football on the sand. And then at night, the parents went and did their thing, and the kids, we went to a club or something. So it was a little bit intermixed. So I don't know. I just associate it with good memories. I don't know if it's first my parents and then my friends, or my friends and my parents. It's just a big blurry but nice memory.
But it's interesting because what you said, I think my question actually comes from a place of, in the US, there's a clear distinction. You're with your parents and then you leave your parents. And you started by saying that's not really our culture. And so my question actually probably doesn't even make sense in the context that you described it, which is there's not a clear delineation. It turns out like the family unit is the family unit and it extends beyond blood, and it gets into, close friends that are like family.
Exactly. I mean, it is like family, exactly like you said. And in this example, like some of my parents' friends, I call them like uncles, and their kids are my cousins, and we couldn't be more distant in terms of like blood relation, but they're the people I grew up with, some of my closest relationships. I have a friend that now lives in in London, not that far from where I live, and we have been friends as long as he's alive.
On that note, I want to talk a little bit about the last thing that you mentioned to me when we were preparing for this, and you talked about the barbecues and the barbecue culture back home, and and it sounded really special, but to me, it also sounded really familiar. And I was curious: are they just around holidays or special occasions, or is it just part of what you do when you have time and you want to spend it with the people that you love? Do you need a reason for a barbecue in Peru?
No, for sure not. Any reason is a good reason, and any day of the week is a good day of the week. I think there is I don't know if to call it like a special relationship, but it's like food brings you together, and it's an excuse to be together and to share time, to share a meal. It could be a barbecue at your place, but equally it could be a different plate that someone decided to prepare for their friends. So it's more of that, having that moment to share together, and barbecue in particular just lends itself well because it takes longer to prepare. For example, we don't have, if you make a barbecue at home, it's not that everyone gets their piece of meat. There's like pieces of meat. They're chopped in tiny like individual pieces, and then like you come and you take a bite and you have a taste of the first batch of meat and the second batch of meat and this type of sausage and this chicken. But it's not like a we sit down dinner and you have like your big piece of meat. No, it's everything shared.
And it sounds like it just extends over hours and hours. And am I right to assume that this includes, again, more than just family, but it includes that extended family and the unofficial family that you mentioned a second ago?
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
The part that stood out to me was my sons have grown up with aunts and uncles and cousins that are not blood relatives either. And it's almost generational. Everybody
Yeah.
of all of my friends and peers are uncle and aunt. All of the people I would say more senior to me are Mr. and Mrs. All of the generation younger than me, which is my kids' peers, they're all cousins.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like the black community is just full of aunties and uncles all over the place. And it actually sounds like it's the same dynamic down in Peru.
Yeah. So, sounds very familiar.
And does that mean that when you throw these barbecues or you have family occasions like weddings or birthdays or anniversary celebrations, it almost becomes a community event?
Yes, maybe the slight difference with Lima is that Lima is like a very big city in terms of like distances. So it is not uncommon that you can live like quite far from each other. So it is a community in sense of like it is like family and you stick together. It is not a function of, oh, we are physically close all the time and therefore that's the community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And it gets back to what you said earlier, which is if I'm going to drive all the way across the city, we're going to spend some hours together.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not going to grab a
Exactly.
plate. I'm not going to grab a plate and move to my next stop.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's not just drive across the city. Like I'm flying back home for Christmas, and some of my cousins also don't live in Lima anymore, and they're flying also for Christmas. And it is a very busy time of the year, just visiting family and the holidays, etc. So we're currently in that all of that coordination. Like, when are we gonna block that whole afternoon just to spend it together, have a bite, have a drink, and laugh and have fun?
I'm certainly looking forward to seeing that when I get down there in a couple of weeks. As we start to wrap, I just wanted to ask you, for everybody listening here, What is the one thing that I should know or that everyone should know about going sort of home to Peru, whether it's their home or not? What's important for them to know as they're going to your home and trying to experience it for the first time?
That's a very tough question, but as you were asking it, like three things came to mind. First one was food. Food is important, both the actual food, and I do think that Peru has one of the best food in the world. I might be biased, but you tell me after you've tried it. But also because of what it means. It like we take great pride in preparing something for someone. I'm sharing with you what I like and my effort, and like we take food seriously. So it's not just the taste, but also the I'll invite you home and I will make something for you, something that I like and that I'm proud of. The second one is probably people, and relationships are really important, and just spending time together. And then the third one is fun. As most South Americans, I think we like to take fun. We like to have fun. I mean, everyone likes to have fun, but there's this sense of joy and like appreciation of life and just like enjoying the moments that we have. So I think that hopefully in the weeks that you spend there, you get to experience this as well.
Santiago, thanks for sharing with me today. Thanks for giving me some insight into what I'm hoping to experience when I get down to Peru.
Thank you so much. I hope you do too, and please let me know if there's anything I can do while you're there and share any more recommendations.
Definitely. And I look forward to talking when I get back.
Me too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes automatically. Go to myhomeisspecial.com for the occasional email update too. That's where links to photo galleries and a few other surprises will live. Be sure to follow KBev Photo on Instagram for behind-the-scenes footage during our journey, and it'll be in the stories. If you just want the photos, go to kbevphoto.com. There's a lot else on there to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.